Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight we are traveling to Japan, a land where mountains, forests, and coastlines breathe with spirits, gods, and stories that have shaped its people across thousands of years. This is the full, unbroken story of Japanese mythology and folklore. Where did the gods first come from? How was the world itself brought into being? And how did tales of storms, sunlight, and shadow become woven into the fabric of daily life? We begin with the birth of the islands, with the creation of the divine pair Izanagi and Izanami, and with the legend of the great sun goddess Amaterasu. Then, we wander through a world of trickster foxes, restless spirits, and heroes who faced monsters with both skill and grace. These are stories that hold beauty beside mystery, history beside imagination, and stories that still echo through shrines and festival grounds and the quiet corners of Japan to this day. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are right now and what the hour is where you sit. If these stories speak to you, please take a moment to comment and subscribe. It costs you nothing and it means more than you know. Thank you for being here. Now, let us begin. In the stillness before all things, there was only a slow and breathing dark. It was neither hollow nor crowded, neither cold nor warm, a quietude that held within it the seed of every movement yet to come. That hush was not a void the way a pit is empty. It was something closer to a cradle, a place where the first suggestions of matter drifted like pollen through air that had not yet learned to move in any direction. Out of that silence, the subtle began to pull away from the dense. What was fine and weightless rose toward heights not yet named, while what was heavy and thick descended toward a place that would one day feel the press of feet. Between them, a vaporous expanse waited, an unworked field of pure possibility. From the rising came a precinct of the pure. It was called the high plane of heaven, a realm so refined that no shadow could find purchase along its edges. From the settling came a place that would one day be known as the central reed plain, raw and wet and restless, a world like a marsh dreaming of becoming a country. Before there were oceans, before mountains had grown their ridges, before trees had learned the patience of rings, there were only tendencies, the first leanings of the world. It is in such uncertain territory that gods are born. The earliest gods appeared not from any parent, but as thoughts made solid by their own clarity. They did not descend from anyone. They rose up from the weave of existence and opened their eyes. They were builders without hands, minds that set order before there were stars to court it. Among them were presences whose very names carry the sound of beginnings. There was the Lord of the august center of heaven, a ruler in absolute stillness. There were the divine generators whose names feel like breath drawn in and slowly released. Not one of them required marriage or birth. They stood of themselves and by themselves. And when their work in that first brightness was finished, they withdrew like a tide that leaves a shore gleaming. More deities rose in quiet succession, each a thread in a cord that would eventually bind heaven to earth. They were not the ones destined to give the world its islands and its weather. They were the ground upon which such acts would become possible. As the generations of those early gods unfolded, the task of creation passed down an invisible line until it reached a pair chosen for the heavy labor of shaping. Their names carry the weight of ceremony. He who invites, she who invites, Izanagi and Izanami. They were not a couple in the way mortals are bound by the slow accumulation of shared days. They were a pairing chosen by a council of older gods who understood that the world below had formed into a beautiful incompletion. The high plane needed builders with nerve and patience, and the central reed plane needed parents. There is a bridge that is not a beam and not a rope, a span that hangs between the world we can taste and the realm we picture when we close our eyes. The gods named it the floating bridge of heaven. Upon this unanchored path, the two stood with their robes stirring in a wind that had not yet found a direction. Into Izanagi's hands, the gods placed a spear, a shaft adorned with jewels that did not glitter so much as glow from within. It was the heavenly jeweled spear, and no ordinary instrument, for its point knew how to locate the heart of chaos. The world beneath them shifted like the skin of a sleeping creature. It was sea and not sea, a softness beneath which the bones of land lay waiting. The two leaned forward as a midwife leans toward the first cry. Together they lowered the spear and dipped its point into the churn below. They did not stab, they stirred. Gently at first, and then with a rhythm that knits loose threads into cloth. When the spear rose, it came up heavy with shining drops that fell back in slow, luminous pearls. Where each drop struck the surface of the unmade sea, a skin formed and thickened. It gathered itself, became a mound, then a mass, then at last an island, the first solid ground beneath heaven. They called it Onagoro, which means self-curdled, a place that chose to exist. There are beginnings within beginnings. The new land needed a center, and the pair descended from the floating bridge onto still damp soil. At the heart of Onagoro, they raised a pillar so tall and graceful that it resembled a reed growing forever upward. Around this pillar, which was at once the axis of the world and the first architecture, Izanagi and Izanami performed a rite. They walked it in opposite directions, as if weaving a knot in the open air. As they passed each other, they exchanged words, and in that moment the first speech rang upon the ear of the earth. Their first attempt at union produced a child that was not as it should be, a soft, formless creature without the bones to stand. The island that accompanied that first child was equally unfit, and both were set adrift upon the water. They brought their sorrow to the gods who had commissioned them, and in that council the error was understood. Form has its etiquette. Words must arrive in their proper order. If the wrong voice speaks first, harmony is bruised. They returned to the pillar, circled it again, this time speaking in the correct sequence, and in that restored ceremony found the answer that unlocks every sealed gate. When they came together after the corrected rite, the land responded. The great 8 islands were born, not all at once like sparks from a struck stone, but the way a family arrives, one after another, each with its own character. Awaji rose first, long and gentle, stretching itself between places not yet risen. Shikoku followed, faceted and calm. Then Oki, Kyushu, Iki, Tsushima, Sado, and finally Honshu, the great spine of the archipelago, rolled its shoulders up from the sea. The people who would one day walk these shores were still the dream of clay, but their roads were already being drawn. Rivers learned their courses. The winds remembered their routes. The coastlines traced elegant parentheses around lives not yet lived. Izanagi and Izanami did not stop at islands. They set about filling the world with texture. They brought forth gods to dwell in tides and currents, to govern fog and rainfall, to take the seat of mountains and nest in valleys. There were deities of marsh and fern, of bark that shields the tree and sap that climbs its veins. They summoned gods of bast fiber and weaving, of rice and the dikes that keep rice fields tame. They breathed out guardians of rooftops and hearths, of thresholds and roads. The catalogue of spirits grew long and radiant. It was as though the pair were painting with living colours, every stroke a god with purposes and stories of its own. In their palace on Onagoro, which no longer stood alone, but as the first of many, there was joy and a sense of vocation. Creation is a high intoxication that leaves the maker brilliant and spent. The sea was salted and given tides. Rivers were shown how to braid through plains. The first forests lifted their layered canopies, and the first cranes rehearsed the patient dance they would perform for future generations. Night did not yet carry the full weight of its velvet. Day had not yet assumed the glory of its crown. Those glories were waiting their turn. In time, Izanami felt a different kind of birth rising within her. This one would not be like the others. There are gifts that arrive wrapped in danger. There are blessings that extract a price. She labored and the world held its breath. And in the moment the child arrived, a blaze ran through her as though the sun itself had chosen to be born through a mortal door. The child was fire-given flesh. His name was Kagutsuchi. Flame is both banquet and plague. It means hearth and it means ash. And the first breath of the fire child scorched the very mother who delivered him. Izanami lay pale and still, her robes crisped at the edges, her lips cracked by the heat she had brought into the world. The palace that had rung with delight fell to silence. Izanagi gathered the child, whose presence still crackled in the air and trembled with divided love and sudden fury. There is a grief that makes even a god act like a man. In a passion that was half justice and half the helpless rage of a husband who cannot call his wife back from the far shore, Izanagi drew his blade. He struck. The bright fireboy died beneath his father's hand, and from the blood that spilled came new and terrible powers. Divinity is fertile, even in death. From the sprayed crimson rose mountains and rivers and gods with the force of molten rock. Where pieces of the severed body fell upon the earth, new spirits arose who would one day preside over mines and forges and plows. If sorrow has any mercy, it is that it is never barren. The world multiplies even as it mourns. Izanagi went to his wife and knelt beside her. She was not cold in the way of stone. She was slipping, drawn by a current whose direction he could not sense. Attendants had laid her hair in careful order and covered her with garments that tried to argue against the truth already settled like a dark bird on the beam of that house. Izanagi spoke to her in the quiet voice that gods use when they are afraid. He told her the sea had need of her. He told her the mountains were asking for her counsel. He told her he had done something terrible but would pull down the stars one by one if it meant keeping her beside him. That she was already listening to a sound he could not hear. The land of the dead was not yet a place of punishment and judgment. It was a realm of return and rest, a shadowed mirror of the world above. Izanami drifted toward it as a person walks down a long beach at dusk. The water she entered was not wet. The light that greeted her was neither dawn nor darkness, but a perpetual afterglow. She looked back only once, and even in that glance her eyes were already filmed by the law of that country. There is a threshold that no hand can hold, not even the hand of a god who summoned islands with a spear. In the halls of Onagoro, a great quiet pressed upon the carved pillars. The gods of wind hushed their music. The gods of rivers kept their sounds beneath the stones. Izanagi felt the particular emptiness that follows the folding of a life. A wise grief knows the world does not pause when one heart stops. The rice plants still seek light. The sand still holds the shape of every footfall, then forgets it. But he was not wise in that hour. He was a husband, and he loved what had gone somewhere that barred its door to pleading. He resolved to break that barring. The high plane had chosen him for his determination, and now he would stake it against the oldest gate of all. He would go down. He would find the entrance to the hidden country and bring her back. This intention was a flame that did not burn his hands. It lit his path along the spilling edge of seas and through ravines where the air smelled of fern and rust. He descended through caverns that sighed with breaths not his own, and descended until the voice of the living world was only a hum at his back and the voice of the underworld trembled before him. A voice that had the shape of a corridor lined with doors that did not open. The entrance to Yomi was not a gate. It was the negative of a gate, a place where a passage had decided not to complete itself. He stood at its lip and felt the cool of a wind that had never touched daylight, and he went in. At first, there was a light like the light that lives behind closed eyelids. Then that faded, and he learned to walk by the memory of her hand. He called her name. The sound was like a bell struck in snow. There were answers in the distance, voices that might have been water, might have been sorrow, talking to itself. He called again, and this time his voice touched something that turned toward him. She was there, but not as he would have wished her, not as she had been beside him on Onagoro, bright as the skin of a fresh seed. But there, in that dusk, her shape moved, and his heart leapt into his throat like a fish startled from shadow. He reached for her. She held back with a gentle firmness. She spoke, and her words did not ring. The way words born in sunlit air ring, she told him she had eaten of the food of this country. That act binds like an oath. The grains of that table had dissolved into her and made a covenant with the dark. She wished to return, but the law of the far side of the stone is clear. She would petition the lords of that realm for her release. She begged him not to look upon her until she had secured their leave. "Promise me," she said. And he promised. He was a god, but he was also a husband in a country made of doubt. Your promises made in the dim require the bright discipline of patience. Izanagi waited in a place where waiting does not flow like a river, but stands like a wall. How long he waited, no measure remembers. Silence in such places thickens until it must be cut. At last, fear bent his promise. He felt for the torch he had kept hidden. He coaxed a spark into flame and lifted it. Light took the room in its hands and showed him what it held. He saw his wife. He saw the companion of his life wearing the terrible crown of a country that devours its guests. Her flesh had taken on the changes of that place. In her hair crouched spirits of thunder, their faces like clenched fists. In her mouth lived a darkness that gnawed at its own edges. From her skin hung heavy shadows, like vines from an abandoned tree. The sight undid him in a way that no blade can. He cried out. The sound woke the house. The wardens of that land stirred. She, who had begged him not to look, felt the betrayal as a blade laid cold against her ribs. There are chases in the world above that end at a fence. In the world below, a chase ends at a stone. Izanagi ran, and the guardians of Yomi ran after him, figures with mouths full of purpose and hands full of the implements of hunger. He fled by the small flame, and the flame shook in the wind of pursuit. He came to the place where the passage narrows into a throat. He pulled free a boulder that was not merely a stone, but also a law, and he wedged it into the gap. The guardians beat upon it with the dull fury of ritual. On one side he panted, a god with ash on his fingers. On the other side, she stood with the calm that anger assumes when it dresses itself in sorrow. She spoke to him then through the rock. Her voice carried enough weight to bend iron. She told him he had shamed her. She told him that because of what he had done, she would drag 1,000 living souls down each day to sit at her tables. He pressed his palm to the stone and answered with a resolve that was also fury. Then I shall cause 1,500 to be born each day, he said. So life will outnumber death, and the living will carry a slender advantage. Between those two sentences, the daily arithmetic of the world was forged into a blade that cuts everyone who has ever breathed. He left the stone where it stood and climbed back through the veins of the earth. When he came into the light of the upper world, the sun settled across his shoulders like a warm shawl. He did not raise his face to it. He had carried back what the underworld always gives to those who walk it, the smell of endings, the dust of a place where names fall away. He was unclean, and though a god's stain differs from a mortal's, stain is still stain. He walked to a clear river that knew how to forget the footprints of birds. At its edge, he removed the garments that had brushed those caverns. From those garments, as he set them aside, spirits arose, small gods climbing free from pressed straw and knotted cord and the folded cloth of an old adventure. Even the act of undressing was like scattering seeds into tilled ground. He stepped into the river, and the water embraced his calves with the sigh of a friend glad to see someone return. He cupped the water and moistened his lips, and the taste was the opposite of Yomi. It was not heavy, it was not old. It was the first brightness poured into a bowl. He washed his left eye. The water caught the sun and flung it back, and out of that ablution rose a goddess who seemed to carry daylight beneath her skin. He washed his right eye, and from that washing stepped a god whose silver composure spoke of the slow march of counted months. He blew the last of the underworld's air from his nose, and out of that exhalation came a god who walked with storm at his heels and sea wind in his hair. 3 great children stood upon the bank as if they had always been waiting to be called by their true names. The sun smiled in the face of the first. The moon bowed in the bearing of the second. The third looked toward the horizon and saw waves lifting like a herd of pale-backed animals. That moment at the river is one of the great hinges of the world. With it, the upper air found its rulers. The goddess of the sun took her place on the high plain, and wherever her gaze fell, green things remembered that growth is a command. The god of the moon learned the secrets of cool passage and marked the steps by which the sea draws breath. The Stormbringer was given charge of the restless waters and the winds that bruised them. Their father stood upon the stones and felt the last filth of Yomi fall from him like dead leaves. He had lost a wife. He had found balance and children in that loss. The world is a market that insists on exchange. We hate it. We live by it. From that day, the making of the world entered a new order. Sun and moon learned their circuits. The islands that had felt the sorrow of their first mother now tasted the patience of regular seasons. The cranes rehearsed their winter migrations. Rice practiced the logic of flood and drain. the gods of hill and river added a new verse to their prayers, for they could feel in those three new presences the first breath of something like an apology. Until then, the earth had been a collection of scattered households. Now, heaven had grown a court. And a court means more than thrones. It means wars and reconciliations, exiles and homecomings, contests that end in laughter and contests that end in blood. Onogoro watched, its pillar still reaching toward the unhandled blue. Izanagi turned away from the riverbank and began to walk. Somewhere under that same sky, on the wrong side of a great stone, his first beloved had become a queen in a country that mortals learn to name in many ways. He did not call out to her again. A promise broken once is not a rope to be tugged. Instead, he looked at the tracks his children had made when they first stood, and understood that the story he had started would now belong to them. The light would enter the cave and come out again. The storm would make mistakes and also miracles. The moon would separate from the sun and teach lovers the particular ache of distance. Everything that would come was already beginning to move. The gods would laugh and rage and shatter and repair the world as only immortals can. Serpents would drink wine and fall to swords. Heroes would be tricked into wisdom. The land would be offered and then yielded. A grandson would walk down a heavenly stairway and press his foot into the soil and call the fields into an order that would one day be written in law and in song. For now, the river ran, and the god who had washed away the smell of the underworld shook his hair and felt clean. In that cleanliness there was grief. Purity does not erase the impression left by love. It does not flatten the place where two once lay, or smooth the stone where a hand once pressed. Izanagi carried the shape of his sorrow like a mark cut into wood. That mark would be read by those who came after. It would be retold. It would become the reason fathers stand with composed faces at the threshold, while mothers teach children that food taken from the wrong table is a chain. The first chapter of any world is a chapter of separations. Heaven separates from earth so that each may become expert at being itself. River separates from sea so that taste may vary and migrations carry meaning. Life separates from death and must then live with the knowledge that the separation is both real and thin. The stone at Yomi is a door and a wall at once. The spear that stirred the first island is both bridge and boundary. The gods who remember this step carefully. The gods who forget learn with bruises. The rest of us listen to their stories and try to find a rule for our small lives. All of this was written into the grain of the world when the first island hardened under the falling drops from a jeweled spear. The palace at the center of Onogoro stands even now in the imagination of the faithful, its pillar rising like a sentence that never quite ends. The names of the great 8 islands are still spoken as if each were a bead worn smooth by years of use. The tale of the fire child is still told around hearths that sometimes forget how to be merciful. The story of the boulder set in the mouth of the earth is still whispered when goodbyes are said to those who will not return. From the riverbank, where a father found 3 sudden lights upon the water, the world leaned forward into its next telling. Grief is a teacher who carries a dark lamp. When Izanami slipped behind the stone of endings, Izanagi learned what no creator wishes to learn, that even a god can be made small by the absence of a companion. The islands he had coaxed from ocean foam stood where he had set them, green and patient. Yet the air of Onogoro tasted of ash. Servants moved with hushed steps. The pillar at the navel of the world seemed taller and lonelier than before. In that stillness, Izanagi chose the impossible path. If love had placed a queen in the land of shadows, love would cross the threshold and ask her back. He began with signs. In the sanctuaries of the high plain, older gods cast lots and read omens that drifted down like pale leaves. The sign declared that the passage into the other realm lay where the earth's skin grew thin and cold. Izanagi wrapped himself in traveling robes and took up a staff that carried the memory of every tree it had once been. He set out along the edges of the islands where cliffs speak the clear language of stone. He crossed beaches of new sand that sang beneath his sandals and followed river mouths where gulls rehearsed their bright disputes. No mortal song marked his way. He was a husband, and that was purpose enough. The entrance to Yomi does not announce itself with a gate or a signpost. It is found by a change in the breath of the world. The wind from the sea fell silent. The insects forgot their lines. The ground lost its warmth as if the sun had gone to visit a different story. A cleft opened in a hillside, furred with ancient moss, and beyond it a corridor sloped into a patient dark. Izanagi did not call out. Names carry power, and he had already spent his own, once in a broken promise. He steadied his heart and went down. The first bend in that corridor tasted of iron. The second smelled like rain that never quite arrives. The third swallowed sound so completely that even his footsteps seemed to wear soft shoes. He met no guardians at the threshold. That custom belongs to later ages. Yomi, in its first telling, accepts the bold and allows them to discover whether they are worthy of regret. He walked until the pressure of the earth above felt like a hand on his crown. Then the passage opened, not into a hall of ceremony, but into a country where color had forgotten its duties. There were plains lit by a light that owed nothing to sun or moon. There were hills that remembered winter without being able to name it. He called for her then. The name rose like a kite that has lost its string. A figure moved on that pale plain, and the world tilted back toward order. Izanami stood before him, veiled by the law of the place she had entered, her voice reaching him as if through woven reeds. She told him she had eaten the food of Yomi. To eat in that country is to swear to remain. She asked him to wait while she petitioned the lords of the deep to release her. He must not look upon her before leave was granted. There were reasons that had no place in sunlight. He swore to honor this. Patience is a high right, and he almost kept it. The stillness grew heavy as roof tiles, and then heavier still. A small and stubborn fear began to climb within him. He turned from the appointed place, found a gap where a root had forced its way through the wall and coaxed a flame from a spark. He raised it. The light showed him what love does not always wish to see. Izanami, who had presided over the world's first nursery, now stood as the mistress of endings. Her body had accepted the order of Yomi. The proud lines of her face were weighted by a rule that eats beauty and calls the eating sacred. Around her crouched 8 thunder spirits, small and swift and cruel, each nested in a ruin of her flesh. Within her mouth a darkness pulsed that was not breath. In her hair the dead winds had taken up residence. He cried out. A grief can be loud enough to wake a city. It can also be loud enough to rouse a nation of shades. The cry ran across the pale plain and through its corridors, and the guardians of that country stirred. They came with the quick, short steps of hunger, their hair dry grass, their eyes the color of broth boiled too long. And Izanami cried out too, not in pity, but in wrath. A promise broken at the edge of the world is an insult that even love cannot smooth. She called for the wardens to take him. Izanagi fled, at first like a god, swift and certain, then like a man with fear shattering his stride. The wardens gained. He reached into his sleeve and drew out the black headdress that marked his rank and cast it behind him. It became a vineyard in a single breath, heavy with glistening clusters. The wardens fell to feeding, tearing at the fruit with an urgency older than manners. He ran on. When the sound of their feasting faded, he pulled the comb from his hair and threw it down. It burst into bamboo, thick and tender, young shoots pushing upward as if they had been planted there from the start. The wardens stopped again to gorge themselves, for even in the underworld, new growth tastes of spring. He ran on. Their hunger did not keep them long. They came after with red mouths, and he heard the sound of pursuit, like gravecloth, dragged over gravel. Ahead stood a grove of low trees laden with round, pale fruit. He seized 3 of them and hurled them back with a prayer that named their sweetness. The fruits burst on the ground, and the scent of them cut like a blade through the chasing pack. Even shades flinched from such perfume. The wardens recoiled, spitting curses. Izanagi sprinted through the gap they left and reached the place where the world narrows into a throat. The passage rose toward a grey light. He climbed and came to a mouth in the earth wider than a city gate. On this side, the air still held a memory of birds. On the far side, a pressure built as if the entire weight of that country were pressed against his spine. He turned, lifted a stone that was also a decree and wedged it into the cleft. The stone was so vast it seemed the earth had been holding it ready for this exact moment. He braced it. The push from below slackened and then stopped. From the other side came a voice that tasted of iron filings. She called him faithless. She vowed to take 1,000 lives each day and seat them at her tables. He answered with the stubborn mercy of a maker, swearing that 1,500 would be born each day in answer. Between those two sentences, the daily accounting of the world found its measure. He stood with his palms against the stone and knew that the first part of the story had closed its door. There would be no return for her. There would be no reunion of hearth and grave. What there would be was balance. The stone has a name in legend. Some call it the Rock of Evenings. Some call it the weight against which tears break. Names of that sort are a kind of dressing for a wound. They keep the air off and let the skin knit. He did not return to Onogoro. He had carried the smell of Yomi in his clothes and his hair, and it clung like smoke. In the order of the gods, contact with death brings defilement. Purity is not whiteness, it is readiness, a state in which one can be spoken through by powers that mean well. Izanagi made for the river at Tachibana in the sun country of Himuka, a place where clean water runs over stones that remember nothing. He removed his sandals, and the act released small spirits who had curled within the woven reeds. He loosened his girdle, and another deity breathed itself into shape from the untied cord. He took off his robe, and from its folds rose gods with the personalities of fresh breezes. He stepped into the river, and the water gave a small start, like a friend surprised by an unexpected arrival. He washed his left arm. And from that, washing a cluster of kami gathered on the bank, each a minor guardian with responsibility over the edges of things. He washed his right arm, and the same occurred. Then he cupped the river and poured it over his face. He began with the left eye. The water caught the sun and returned it, and out of the brightness a goddess rose with a bearing that could instruct kings. Her radiance was not glare, it was the active calm of full noon. She stood with her hair bound at the horizon and lifted her eyes. The water ran to her feet and seemed content to have arrived there. She spoke her name and the rocks listened. She was Amaterasu, the one who illuminates the plane of heaven. He washed his right eye, and this washing drew a different light, cool and deliberate, the kind of light that tells shepherds when to fold their tents. From that washing, a god rose with a face in which patience and distance had married. This was Tsukuyomi, the lord of measured nights, who would number the months for fishermen and teach the silverfish of the sky how to serve as a clock. He did not smile. His presence was gentleness braided with law. Finally, Izanagi sealed one nostril and breathed out the last of Yomi's air that had lodged within him. From that gesture arose a god whose stride had the breadth of weather. He smelled of salt and the iron taste of approaching rain. He was Susanoo, the restless one, with hair like a gathering storm and a spirit that found kinship with every wave that struck a rock and struck it again. He stamped once, and the river made a respectful bow. The three stood on the pebbled shore, the sisters and the brother, not born of a bed, but of a cleansing. That is the logic of their power. They are the children of a refusal to remain stained. The river widened. The birds returned to their proper noise. Izanagi looked upon the trio with a satisfaction that did not erase sorrow, but made it bearable. He had lost one and gained three, and the arithmetic was not cruel. He assigned their domains with the firm voice of a sovereign who has built fields and knows how to divide them. Amaterasu would ascend to Takamagahara and govern the expanse where clouds learn their shapes. Tsukuyomi would number the nights and tend the quiet economies of tide and temper. Susanoo would take charge of seas and storms and all things that test the courage of ships and the humility of sailors. The chronicles of that purification list many more kami born from that rite, a whole court of thresholds and transitions. There was a goddess for the crossing of rivers and a god for the clearing of impurities at the edge of a village. There were guardians of drains and patrons of gutters, powers that blessed the most modest of boundaries. This theology of edges is one of the deep colors of the old faith. The sacred is found not only in heights, but in the careful tending of seams. When a road leaves a forest, there is a god watching that step. When a child crosses from fever to health, there is a god that registers the change with a quiet nod. Izanagi stood in the flood of such presences and understood that the world had been cleaned and reset. He did not curse Yomi. He did not forget it either. In the ordinary speech of the shrines, and death is not evil, it is heavy, it stains, it requires washings and recitations, and then life may resume. He shook his hair and felt the last weight slide away. He ordered a shrine raised for the peach that had turned back his pursuers, a gesture of gratitude for sweetness that saves. He ordered rites for the spirits that arise from clothing and tools, which teach even immortals to treat their possessions with care. Then he turned his attention to the future, which now wore the faces of 3 young gods. Amaterasu ascended. Stories say she carried with her the mirror in which the world learns to recognize itself, and that when she is seated, it is upon a throne of white that forgets no vow. She brought a light that is not merely brightness, but a discipline of warmth. Under her gaze, rice remembers to be generous and cranes find the patience to stand in snow like lines in a poem. In time, her court would grow elaborate, and her quarrels would summon both comedy and crisis in equal measure. But in this first moment, she was only purpose. Tsukuyomi moved differently. He does not climb in a blaze, he steps. He is the arithmetic of the sea's surface and the poet of frost. In his company, fishermen learn which nights speak kindly and which do not. Lovers learn when to trust messages written in silver. Farmers learn to recite the names of months as if they were beloved relations. He is a quieter glory than his sister, and quiet glories tend to endure. Susanoo lingered by the shore, restless in his new station. There are spirits born from cleansing who immediately seek a new stain to scour. He looked toward horizons and saw shapes that needed wrestling. His temper set the first hammering of distant thunder to a rhythm that fighting men would long remember. He was not wicked. He was a wind in need of a harness and a wave in need of a coastline. Both would come. Izanagi, who had begun the world with a spear and set its balances with a stone, walked away from Tachibana with the newly given powers at his back. The page had turned. In a mythic age, turning a page is a work to which rivers and mountains must agree. They agreed. In the beginning of their rule, the 3 children did not yet know how sharp the edges of family love can become. The assignments were clear. Amaterasu held the high plane and wore the work of day upon her brow. Tsukuyomi kept the silver record of the night. Susanoo patrolled the borders of sea and weather. That clarity was a map, yet maps do not steal the wildness from hearts. The sun had the serenity of rightful place. The moon had the patience of numbers. The storm had the ache of an unfinished grief. For Susanoo carried a wound named for his dead mother, and it pulled at his temper the way the tide pulls at a boat. Tsukuyomi was first to lose his balance. Amaterasu sent him to attend a banquet given by the goddess of food, called Ukamochi in the old songs, who wished to honor both the court of heaven and the realm below with a feast drawn from every quarter of the world. She turned to the sea and breathed out fish already seasoned with waves. She faced the mountains and offered game dressed in the herbs of upper slopes. She looked upon the rice fields and filled bowls with grain steamed in its own fragrance. The making of food is a sacred art, and in those early days it was raw miracle. Tsukuyomi watched the goddess work and felt revulsion instead of reverence, for he saw that the gifts came from places that would later be hidden behind kitchen walls. Seized by a proud and ill-considered disgust, he slew the very host who had set the table. So ends one of the worst dinners in myth. Amaterasu heard of this, and her grief sharpened into judgment. She called the act shameful and decreed that Tsukuyomi should never again stand before her face. From that ruling comes the custom by which sun and moon do not share the same sky. Day and night part company like estranged kin who communicate only through the turning of seasons. In some tellings, the food goddess does not remain dead. From the places where her body fell, there rose the blessings of field and silk and millet and horse. If so, it is yet another instance of the way old stories weave sorrow into harvest. But the stain upon Tsukuyomi's name endured, and he withdrew to the realm his office required, a lord of measured distance. All this while, Susanoo stormed. He wept and raged for the mother who had gone down among the dead. He churned seas and tore trees up by their roots and made even the brave gods of the high plain fill their sleeves with stones and watch the sky with unease. At last, their father, Izanagi, who had set the balance of births against deaths and washed the underworld from his skin, told Susanoo to depart. The decree fell from a mouth that did not issue idle commands. Susanoo was to leave and take up his station in the lands below. Before he went, he declared he would bid his sister farewell and prove his heart held no poison. Amaterasu is a sovereign who counts the cost of errors. When word came that her unruly brother was climbing toward the high plain, she girded herself for trouble. She bound up her hair with authority and armed herself with the jewels of office. She arranged her court and received him with a vigilance that wore the face of grace. Susanoo declared he had no wish to unseat her or overturn the halls. She did not believe him. He asked for a trial that would reveal the truth of his intention. "Let us each draw children from the other's regalia," he said. "Let the nature of those children speak for the purity of our purpose." It was a peculiar kind of contest. Amaterasu took the sword of Susanoo and broke it into 3 pieces, cleansed the shards with words, and from the breath that rose over that washing came 3 goddesses whose dignity shone like the line between day and night. Susanoo in turn took the string of Magatama jewels worn at his sister's breast, crunched them between his teeth and breathed out mist. And from that mist rose 5 male gods with proud brows and the restlessness of eldest sons. Susanoo claimed victory, declaring that the 5 boys were born of his own breath and proved his sincerity. Amaterasu countered that because the boys had emerged from her jewels, they belonged to her, while the 3 maidens had come from his sword and were therefore his. When she made this accounting, he shouted triumph again, since the 3 goddesses were each worth a kingdom, and had issued from what he offered. In truth, neither claim mattered to what happened next, for the contest had stoked the heat in his blood and victory made it boil. He ran through her sacred rice fields and burst the banks that kept the water patient. He tore up furrows with the careless joy of a boy who has gone too far. He defiled the clean halls where cloth is stretched and beaten into a sheen, as if he could not tolerate the existence of order maintained by rhythm. And at last, worst of all, he took a horse from the heavenly stables, flayed it, and threw the carcass through the roof of the weaving hall. The sacred craft was broken. A maiden died with her shuttle still in her hand. The act was desecration, a wound to the household of heaven, a blow to the art by which garments are made for kings and for gods. Yet even those who had loved the storm, God looked away. There is a moment when a queen refuses to receive another blow. Amaterasu left the court. She walked to a mountain gorge where a cave opened like a dark mouth. She entered that hollow and pulled a stone door closed against the world and sat in its throat. She did not sulk. She removed herself from a creation that had forgotten how to deserve light. The withdrawal of a sun is not a metaphor in the language of gods. Day ended, crops bent and then failed. Wolves took courage. Things that live by hiding learned a new boldness and came to stand at the very doors of houses. The heavens lost their lamp and despair settled like a second night. The gathering of gods that followed is among the most beloved councils in any mythology. They came from every distant province, powers who usually keep to their own territories, and crowded the riverbanks below the cave's mouth. There were smiths whose anvils never cool. There were jewelers whose hands sing when they touch stone. There were singers and dancers whose feet remember the world before it was named. The gravity of disaster gave them a shared wit. They talked until their breath made its own small wind and decided that laughter might succeed where anger had failed. The plan required 3 gifts and an extraordinary performance. First, they asked the master smiths to forge a mirror broader than the face of a great drum, a disc so polished it could hold an entire sky without a ripple. Second, they asked the jewel maker to string together a length of curved gems as green as wet pine and as red as heated silk, to be hung where they might delight the eye of a goddess who has never been entirely resistant to beauty offered with kindness. Third, they gathered a great number of roosters and set them to crow without ceasing, so that their sound would be present at the threshold of the dark. Then they cleared a space, turned a wooden tub upside down to make a stage, and onto it climbed Ami no Uzume, goddess of dawn and dance and unashamed laughter. She was small and strong, and her voice could ring against a mountain face. She stamped upon the tub until the wood barked like a seal. She told jokes with the frankness of a festival and moved her body with the language that remembers where life begins. The other gods whooped and called out as though an abundant harvest were being counted into baskets. The valley filled with a brightness of sound so loud that even grief sat up and turned its head. Inside the cave, Amaterasu felt the vibration of joy and frowned. She had left a world that had forgotten how to be serious. Why then were they celebrating at the door of endless night? She called out and asked what cause for delight could exist while the fields withered and the courts sat in darkness. Outside, Ami no Uzumi declared that they had found a goddess more magnificent than the sun, a new light whose face glowed with a freshness that made all other day look tired. Pride and curiosity touched a place in Amaterasu that no sorrow can permanently seal. She pushed the stone door open a little way and looked out. They had dressed a tree with white cloth and green boughs. They had hung the long string of jewels from its branches. They had placed the great mirror at an angle. When Amaterasu leaned toward the noise and the claims, she saw a radiant figure shining at the cave's entrance. She did not know it was herself. Gods are as susceptible as we are to the shock of their own reflection. She stepped closer, and the face in the mirror brightened and drew near. At that instant, a powerful deity seized her wrist and drew her out into the open. Others swung the stone door closed and dragged a sacred rope across it, a cord knotted in such a way that even a goddess pauses before crossing it. Light spilled over the valley like water from a split vessel. The gods rejoiced, and at last the roosters crowing fit the world again. The relief ran through every order of being. Rice lifted its young blades, the carp turned on their sides and showed gold. Even stones seemed to smile in their slow way. The priests of later centuries would reenact the raucous dance at village squares and in solemn theatres. For it is right to laugh at the memory of disaster overcome by wit. As for Susanoo, the court exacted its penalties. His hair was cut, his nails were torn out. He was expelled from heaven at last and sent toward the country of Izumo by a law that could no longer be argued with. He went like a storm that has spent itself over mountains and now heads for open land in search of a new argument. It is worth pausing over what was gathered at the cave's mouth. The mirror would become one of the treasures by which a sovereign is recognized, a reminder that good rule is reflective rather than blind, that it requires a face willing to see itself and be corrected. The string of jewels remembers the first economics of worship and the way the heart is steered toward attention through the kindness of beauty. The rope drawn across the cave mouth is the ancestor of every sacred boundary marked at shrines, the reminder that there are thresholds which should only be crossed in the right state of mind. And the dance of Uzume endures wherever ceremony understands that the sacred is not only severe, joy is a right as binding as grief. Exile does not quiet a wind, it redirects it. When the court of the high plain cut Susanoo's nails and trimmed the fury from his hair and sent him down, the sea received him at once. He fell toward the green provinces of the mortal world, the way a squall falls, with clear intent and salt on its mantle. The decree that banished him did not remove his nature. It gave the earth the opportunity to school it. The waves along the coast of Izumo received him with the booming welcome that stones give to breakers, and the god of storm and sea stepped ashore into a land of reeds, broad rivers, and mountain ridges. He walked inland along a river that ran white at its edges and dark in its belly, and followed it until he heard human voices thick with grief. The sound came from a modest house pressed close to a bank that had seen floods. Inside, an old man and an old woman were trying to convince their hands not to tremble. Between them sat a young woman whose face wore the particular calm of those who have watched hope depart one room at a time and have learned not to summon it by name. Susanoo asked the cause of their grief. The old man looked up and saw a figure whose eyes carried broken weather and sudden sunlight. He bowed until his forehead found the floor and explained that his name was Ashinazuchi, that his wife was Tenazuchi, and that their daughter was called Chushinada Hime. Once they had 8 daughters. Each year a monster came down from the mountain and took one, and that debt had been paid 7 times. The night would come when the beast would claim the last. There was no cliff tall enough to guarantee a fall that could save them. There was no shrine strong enough to hide a heartbeat. So they wept and waited for a door that had no hinge. When Susanoo asked the name of the valley, learned it lay in the region called Koshi, and asked about the family's lineage, he discovered they traced their blood to the family of the food goddess once wronged by the moon. Through such connections does destiny set its snares and its rescues. He told the parents his name and declared that if they would give the girl to him in marriage, he would cut calamity out of their story. The old man swore by every god who listens that he would seal the marriage with gratitude as well as law. The storm god nodded once, and at that nod, the rafters remembered how to stand straight. Kushinadahime was the color of rice flowers when the wind moves through them. Of such people, it is best to speak simply. And Susanoo knew that a man who raises a sword above a monster must first place his beloved beyond that sword's wide swing. He touched her hair and changed her into a fine-toothed comb and set that comb behind his ear so that her voice might offer counsel and her nearness keep his heart steady. He stepped outside and looked upriver toward the mountain pass. He could feel the great animal presence turning its many heads toward the valley. The monster was called Yamata no Orochi. Old tellers say it had 8 heads and 8 tails, a body so vast that it sprawled across 8 hills and 8 valleys, as though a mountain range had learned how to writhe. Its eyes burned red as wine left too long beside a brazier. On its back, fir trees had taken root as if it had been a ridge since the world was new. Its belly was ribboned with festering wounds through which it drooled the poison of corroded metals. The river foamed when it exhaled. This was no neat dragon. It was a memory of chaos come down in scales. Susanoo did not charge. He had learned in heaven that his temper makes errors when it rushes. He called for casks. He had the old man brew a rice wine so potent its smell pulled at the roots of the tongue. They built a fence of heavy posts, and in that fence they made 8 gates. Behind each gate they set one great vat of the fierce drink. They sealed the fence as carefully as a priest seals a sacred letter. Then the storm god stood back and rested his hand on the hilt of a sword that knew it was about to learn a better purpose. Even monsters have habits. As the appointed evening pressed a cold finger along the river, Orochi came down from the pass with the slow inevitability of a landslide. Each head tasted the air and found the sweetness of the wine and pressed forward toward a gate. The fence held. The heads dipped. They drank. The sake was an ocean to them, and they plunged their throats into it until the vat stood empty and their tongues lolled from their mouths and the tips of their tails twitched with the foolish contentment of the thoroughly drunk. Their eyelids dragged closed. A mountain fell asleep. Susanoo moved then. He did not roar. He stepped through the fence with the composure of a man checking the locks on a temple he has just lit. He brought his blade down on one neck and then on another. Clean work, without flourish. And the heads rolled away like hailstones that cannot melt. He waded forward through blood that ran black in the darkness and silver in the moonlight, and at each stroke the force of the storm found a better application than anger. He cut the body into sections thorough enough that it could never reassemble itself and stand again. The earth shuddered. The river boiled with the hot disorder that follows justice well done. When he reached the last great tail, he struck and felt his blade jar, metal against metal. He frowned and cut again and found, within the tail, a sword of such extraordinary fineness that he caught his breath. It carried the memory of clouds gathering and of the clear mind that disperses them. They named it Ami no Murakumo no Tsurugi, the heavenly sword of gathering clouds. It would later be called Kusanagi, the grass cutter, for a deed belonging to another age. Susanoo lifted the blade and understood that sometimes a creature dies not only to end a hunger, but to release a gift that was locked inside it all along. He washed the sword and held it up to the night. Then, because even the proud know when a gesture of repair is owed, he sent the sword to Amaterasu in the high plain. "Let this be a token," the message said, "that your brother has learned at least one way to serve the work of order." In later centuries, people would say that this blade, together with a mirror and a jewel, were the three objects by which a sovereign is known. In this first moment, it was simply a beautiful thing recovered from the belly of chaos and passed upward with a bow. With the serpent destroyed, Susanoo returned to the house by the river and took the comb from his hair. Kushinada Hime stood in the room like a kept promise. He married her with words that acknowledged that tenderness is also a form of strength. They built a home at Shuja in Izumo, where the air is as clear as spring water at the foot of a cedar. And there, the storm god is said to have spoken the first poem composed in the Japanese tongue, a verse comparing the making of a home to the gentle surrounding of a bride. A verse that comes to rest at the end, like a long breath finally released. Susanoo did not become a gentle spirit. He remained changeable as light on a wave. Yet the valley learned that his path could be aligned with the safety of its fields. He taught people how to cut channels that let floods run where floods should run. He reminded them to anchor their rooftops to their frames. He stood between the rage of the sea and the threat of fire and called each by its proper name. He had once torn up dikes in a fit of careless triumph. Now he showed boys how to press their feet against a wall's base and test it the way a sailor tests a line with his hands and his ear. From time to time, he would go down to the shore and stand with the tide in his eyes, then return carrying fish whose scales looked like small coins of sunrise. The old couple lived out their years with a grandchild on each knee and with the settled understanding that the mountain pass above the river no longer contained a mouth that opened into their kitchen. Islands endure by the patience of their makers. After the serpent was cut and the river of Izumo ran clean, the work of shaping the country passed to hands that favored craft over clamor. Susanoo had given the valley a thunder lesson and a love poem. What the land needed next was a steward who would make roads where there had been only tracks, who would coax medicine from bitter roots, who would teach spirits and people how to share a calendar. That steward rose from the lineage of the storm. He is remembered by a name that is both title and destiny, master of the great land, Okuninushi. He did not begin as the tallest presence in the grove. He was the youngest among a multitude of brothers, so numerous that storytellers give up counting and call them 80. They were proud hunters who spoke of courtship as if it were a game played with spears. Their target was a princess of the Iniba region, a woman of clear mind and eyes like clean river water, named Yakami Hime. The 80 brothers set out to win her with the swagger of men who assume that the door of a heart opens to noise. Okuninushi traveled behind them like a servant, bent beneath their baggage, his shoulders marked by the straps. There is a kind of greatness that walks at the back of a procession and learns to see what leaders miss. On the way, the company came upon a white hare in dreadful pain. Its skin had been stripped, and the creature shivered on a patch of sand that stung it with every breath. The elder brothers laughed at the animal and offered cruel counsel. They told it to bathe in salt water and lie in the wind. The poor beast did as instructed, and its agony grew like fire in dry brush. Then the last man to pass set down his burdens and knelt. Okuninushi spoke as one speaks to children and to those who suffer. "Wash first in fresh water," he said. "Then rest upon a bed of soft reeds and let the pollen be your remedy." The hare did this and was restored by the simple kindness of water and plant dust. It stood whole again and blessed the man who had seen it, prophesying that the princess of Inaba would not choose a suitor who mocked suffering. She would choose the one who had stopped to help. And so it happened. Yakami Hime held a court of her own judgment. She looked past ornaments and boasts and named the youngest as her husband. The 80 brothers burned with insult, and their burning was dangerous. Pride that has been cut bleeds rage. They tried to kill their brother with a scheme that would have suited ogres. They lured him into a burning trap and left him as ash for the wind. In one version of the telling, it is his mother who found a way to call him back. In another, gods of healing stepped out of groves and mountains and brought him around with herbs and breath. Whichever the path, the boy who had lifted a hare to mercy was lifted in turn by hands that had mercy for him. He rose with scars that would later read like scripture. The elder brothers tried again, and the world grew weary of their malice. His mother urged him to flee south to the deep root of the earth, where Susanoo kept a house beneath thunder. "If you would live," she said, "go down and seek the storm father. Take his tests. Win his regard. Come back carrying a weapon that jealous kin cannot turn." Okuninushi obeyed because obedience to wise counsel is a form of courage that ballads do not always honor loudly enough. The path to that underground palace led through valleys where the wind smelled of iron and through halls lit by a glow that seemed to rise from within the stones. There, in a fortress of strange hospitality, he met a daughter of Susanoo named Suseri Haim. She saw in him what he did not yet know he possessed, the steady flame that cooks food without charring it. Love found its sentence in their first glance. Susanoo arrived with a laugh like surf under a cliff and stared at the visitor who intended to marry his child. The old storm does not give consent without a trial. If you seek to be kin, he said, then spend this night in the hall where serpents sleep. The snakes are not hospitable. The boy went to the hall and Suseri Haim slipped him a scarf imbued with a protection charm. When the snakes raised their heads, he wrapped himself in the gift and their strike could not find his skin. Other tests followed, each with the flavor of an object lesson. Survive a room of centipedes whose armor rattles against itself. Escape a chamber filled with bees that smell fear with an honest nose. Sleep in a storehouse full of things that wake if you look at them wrong. In each case, the daughter supplied the wisdom that balances vigilance. She taught him that a cord can become a leash for trouble, that a melody can turn anger aside, that a grain of patience is a mountain in disguise. At last, Susanoo set the sharpest test. He asked the young man to draw his hair into a knot, pin it with a bowstring, and then sent him out to an empty field and set the grass alight around him. Flames drew a circle and began to tighten. Okuninushi did not thrash at the fire or plead with the sky. He remembered the lesson that a blade cuts grass when it must. He opened a path where the ring was weakest and walked through the heat that had tried to frame his last breath. Satisfied, or at least contained by a respect he did not always admit, Susanoo tested the youth one final time. He hung the great sword that had once been drawn from a serpent above the marriage bed, as if to remind all parties that a god keeps his edge even in domestic comfort. The gesture was a gruff blessing, dressed as a warning. He then gave his daughter to the survivor with a look that said, "Take care of what I love, and I may, on a good day, remember to approve." He offered words that could bind and words that could loosen. The young couple left the halls beneath the earth and rose again into the lands of light, carrying with them gifts less visible than swords. They had patience and a habit of listening and the understanding that a house survives when its keepers reach for laughter before anger finds the floor. Once returned to the river world, Okuninushi set about his great work. In the old tongue they call it the building of the land. The phrase means more than walls and fields. It means the art by which spirits and mortals learn to share a calendar. He became the one to whom local gods brought their disputes. He learned the names of marshes and the temperaments of winds. He taught forms of healing that moved beyond the camp recipe and became a body of prayers and instructions. These details make historians frown and grandparents smile. A people is held together by such fragments. In this labor, he found a companion as unlikely as legend can provide. The figure was tall to the knee and curiously small above it, sharp of eye and quick of hand. He was called Sukunabikona, which is to say, the Little Lord, and he came ashore one day on a seed pod that served as a boat. Some say he had slipped from the sleeve of a god who was passing overhead. Others say he was born from a grain tossed aside by a careless giant. However he arrived, he greeted Okuninushi with the cheerful insolence of someone who knows he will endear himself before the day is out. Together, they cleared away sickness and taught the brewing of medicines that eased bone ache and soothed difficult births. They taught farmers the particular courtesy by which a field repays its keeper. They chased uncanny pests from granaries with ceremonies that look like jokes and function like locks. They set boundary stones that spirits could respect and taught the songs one sings when asking a hill to share a road. For a time, the pair was a study in mismatched scale and perfect aim. Then, as odd companions do, the small one said farewell and leaped across the sea to live where distance prevents visits. Okuninushi watched the glittering path of his departure and returned to his rounds with the particular quiet that follows the end of a good chapter. By now, the 80 brothers had exhausted their malice. Some had fallen to their own devices. Others had wandered off into a useful obscurity. The The master of the great land stood in a harvest plain and saw that the gods of the hills no longer came down to ruin crops at night. Children played at imitating his stride, which is how a people decides what a hero looks like. The shrines that rose under his guidance faced east and west with a correctness that kept the weather civil. The first markets formed at the edges of festivals and grew into meetings where news found its feet. Order in one realm draws the attention of another. In the high plain, Amaterasu had returned to her duties and the court had rebuilt what the storm had broken. From that height, she and her council looked down and saw a land ready for its next sentence. They had long held the intention that the line of the high plain would one day take stewardship of the reed plain below. The pact between the realms needed to be made. The decision was to ask for a handover and to send proof that refusal would be unwise. If such is the way of many treaties, before force, words, after words, the right messenger. Envoys came and went. One descended by the noses of mountains and the channels of gullies and stood before Okuninushi to present the request with a courtesy sharpened by destiny. The master of the great land did not reach for his own sword. He called his sons. The first was Kotoshironushi, a god of harbors and good fortune, who knows that a ship must consent to be lucky. He listened without reluctance. He agreed. He took up his boat and his fishing hook and withdrew to quiet places, and the sea made room for his keel as a good host makes room for a guest whose wisdom is known. The second son was Take Minakata, a power of the arm and the proud shoulder, a god whose faith lives in his sinew. He walked down from the north, where mountains give men a direct temper. He looked upon the envoy and declared himself unwilling to yield any ground to heaven. When speeches fail, men and gods go to grips. They seized each other by the wrist. Takaminakata felt a hand that shifted under his palm and became first ice and then flame. And in that transformation, he began to understand that he was not wrestling a mere courier. He strained and stamped and felt his own considerable strength matched and surpassed without anger. Then he was thrown and pinned with a force that did not injure but offered no argument. He rose from the dust with a pulled pride and departed for the province of Shinano, where rivers are young and promises carry the weight of mountains. Okuninushi watched his sons choose their paths and weighed the offer of heaven against the health of the land he had taught to breathe. He asked for something both modest and magnificent. If I yield the surface and the sunlight to the grandchild of the high plain, let me keep the realm that eyes cannot reach, the hidden part of the world, the space behind the hedge where secrets rest. Build me a shrine that honors this office, a house with pillars so tall that cranes will mistake it for a cliff, and a roof so generous that rain will hush its own noise upon it. Let the people understand that the unseen holds as much life as the seen. In return, I will give the open country to the new order and bless its plows. The bargain pleased both sides. Craftsmen gathered with the eagerness that follows a commission worthy of song. They felled cedar and cypress with prayers that asked the trees to walk willingly into their new purpose. They shaped beams that remembered the mountain even as they learned to become roof. They raised a staircase like a quiet ladder for gods. They laid white gravel that looks like fallen starlight that no one has thought to sweep away. The shrine at Izumo rose and spread its eaves like a sheltering arm. In seasons of festival, many gods visit, and it seems the air there has more rooms than the eye can count. For Okuninushi, the place became both palace and promise. When the shrine was consecrated, the master of the great land set aside the name that belongs to the surface of affairs. He did not die. He turned. He entered the courteous shadows and took charge of the world that lives behind the curtain. In song, he is called the Great Spirit of the Unseen Land. If you whisper at a crossroads and your whisper is not wasted, it is his office that makes the whisper worth the breath. If a plan works because you remembered to be kind at its beginning, someone may say he walked beside you that day and adjusted your elbow at the right moment. Thus, the land passed from the stewardship of a patient maker to the care of a lineage that would one day send a prince out of the clouds. The transfer was not a transaction. It was a ceremony conducted by souls who had grown large enough to understand what they were offering. The earth kept its household gods. Heaven set its seal. The story that begins with a spear stirring a primordial sea now prepared to welcome a foot from the sky. There is a way a story tilts. When heaven decides to step upon the earth, it does not fall like a stone or drift like a leaf. It lowers itself with ceremony, the way a great lantern is lowered into a hall that has been swept of every last grain of dust. From the high plain, the sun goddess looked upon the reed plain below and saw a land ordered by patience and by treaty, a country that had learned the vocabulary of irrigation ditches and the courtesy of shrines. The time had arrived to join sky to soil with a living connection, not a span of rope or cloud, but a person who would carry the weight of daylight in his bones. Her first candidate had not been the grandson. She had turned to her son, the master of broad skies, and asked him to descend and rule. He looked upon the earth and hesitated, for he understood that the work of founding is a long meal with hard bread, and he wished to be certain the table was set. Messengers went ahead instead, and one of them lost himself in the pleasures of the lower world, won over by a bride and lulled by the comfortable untruths of ease, until an arrow sent back to him made plain that such forgetfulness carries a fatal cost. The lesson was absorbed. Heaven must send not a wanderer, but a scion with a mandate bright enough to dissolve doubt. So the choice fell upon the grandson of the sun goddess, a young god named Ninigi. He was given a company of deities to guide and protect and advise him, for even a divine prince benefits from counsel and from roads that others have already walked. The path led through the ledges of cloud to the mountains of the south, where cedar holds the earth with confidence. People called this descent the coming of the heavenly grandchild, and it was the hinge by which the age of gods would swing toward the world of men. Before he left, his grandmother placed 3 objects in his keeping, each one older in meaning than any throne. The first was a mirror wrought so perfectly that light rests upon it the way water rests in a still bowl. The second was a string of curved jewels, the color of deep wine and wet pine, smooth and heavy with a patient glow. The third was a sword that had once slept inside a serpent and had been lifted from the wound by a god who had finally learned the better use of his anger. These were not gifts, they were pledges. The mirror promised rule that considers before it acts. The jewel promised a bond between ruler and ruled that is both beautiful and binding. The sword promised the courage to cut away whatever endangers fields and families. Ninigi and his company descended with the ceremony that such a moment requires. At the boundary between sky and hill, they found a tall and formidable spirit who stands at the threshold of the lower world, the Lord of the Great Way, whose name carries the squint of a sailor staring into the sun. He refused at first to step aside, for threshold gods are neither bribed by titles nor dazzled by processions. The company did not draw weapons. Ame no Uzumi stepped forward, and as she had done at the mouth of the cave, she translated necessity into delight. She brought laughter to the feet of the guardian and praised his pride with words that were both warm and true. He smiled, and his stubbornness loosened. He led them down the correct spur into the mountains of Kyushu and stood by as Ninigi placed his foot upon the peak of Takachiho. The air tasted of cedar and river and the beginning of a story that would be told for centuries. He set in order the treasures brought from heaven and began the work of rule. Rule in old lands is not the issuing of commands. It is the slow establishment of right relations between fields and floods, between shrines and markets, between old gods and new names. Ninigi brought a steadiness that pleased the hills. He did not chase the local spirits from their homes. He invited them to share a calendar. They agreed because agreement had been made possible by courtesy. Soon, there came a day when the mountain god of that region sent 2 daughters to visit the new lord. The elder was Izanagi, the Lady of the Rock, whose presence carries the quiet of granite and the stubborn comfort of stone warmed by a long afternoon. The younger was Konohana Sakuya, the Lady of Blossoms, whose step has the light rhythm of spring and whose face carries more promise than a field of buds. The father sent both daughters so that the ruler who accepted them would receive a double blessing. Through the rock he would endure, through the blossom he would be radiant and abundant. Ninigi saw the younger first. He loved at once. He asked for her hand and did not ask for the elder. The message returned to the mountain god, who, fair-minded as he was, had felt the edge of insult. He sent back a warning wrapped in courtesy. You have chosen the flower and turned away the rock. Because you refuse the elder, your line will be lovely, but brief. Had you married both, your descendants would have lasted as long as mountains last. Thus did a god write mortality into the account books of kings and of ordinary people alike. The tale is unsparing, and yet it holds the truth that we reach for brightness even when we know it does not last. We are as much made by that choice as by our breath. Ninigi and Konohana Sakuya Jaime were married with rites proper to a union meant to anchor a realm. The bride had not long been in joy before a cloud crossed the household. She conceived quickly, and her husband felt a small doubt rise in him like a fish testing the surface. He wondered whether the child was truly his. Doubt in a ruler is an acid. It eats wood and then stone, and then the hand that holds both. Konohana Sakuya Jaime answered the spreading poison with a trial that has been told around hearths ever since. She built a birth hut of reeds and entered it when the time came. She told him that if the child within her were not his, the fire would take her. She set the hut alight and sat at its center as if seated in the heart of a full moon. Fire eats first greedily, and then with a kind of grace. The neighbors watched with drawn faces, and the husband stood with a mouth that had forgotten how to close. When the roof came down, it fell around her and not upon her. She walked out bearing a son whose skin glowed with the health of vindication. She was followed by another son, and in some tellings, a third. The youngest of those sons had a name that remembered slopes and antlers. He was the prince of the mountain hunt, and it is his story that will carry us next into oceans and palaces and encounters with kings who wear scales. Before we follow him, we should see the shape of the home he left. Ninigi governed from the south with the composure his grandmother had passed to him with the mirror. He learned which harvest prayers belong before the planting and which before the threshing. He settled disputes with a patience that taught people to bring him their troubles before they carried them to their fists. He was not a builder in the way the master of the great land was, one who measured roads and negotiated with spirits. He was a settler of high order. The difference matters. Builders bring things together. Rulers hold them together. The archipelago needed both. Rivalry begins as a small crease in a shared cloth. In the house of Ninigi, it took the form of two brothers whose gifts pulled in different directions. The elder loved the sea and knew its pulses the way a harper knows strings. He is called Hoderi in old speech, the one whose catch piles high upon the shore. The younger loved the mountains and the silence of stalked paths. He is called Huri, the prince who learns patience from the angle of a hillside. Between them lay an affection that could have been a bond and a pride that could become a flint. The quarrel did not begin with insult. It began with curiosity. "Let us trade our tools for a time," said the younger. "Give me your hook and take my bow. I will learn the sea and you will learn the hunt." The elder agreed, for brothers before wisdom arrives often think that a simple exchange can do no harm. Huri took the hook and went down to the water's edge and made his line ready. He cast as one casts a question and waited. The line drew tight, then went slack, and in the slow theatre of trial and error, the hook was gone. Perhaps it caught in a rock. Perhaps a great fish carried it off in a sudden rush. Perhaps the sea simply decided that the tool of a fisherman had no business on the thumb of a hunter. Huri searched the shallows and then searched further. He made many new hooks and offered them with a bowed head. Hoderi refused to be satisfied. Only the original hook would do, the very iron shaped by the very hands that had first shaped it. That stubborn answer sent a young man under the waves and into halls where daylight is only a rumor. Huri went to his father and asked for counsel. Ninigi did not scold. He was the kind of ruler who knows that blame does not grow hooks from water. "Find where lost things are kept," he said. "There are palaces beneath the floor of the sea, and they have their chiefs and their treasure rooms. Go not as a thief, but as a guest, with good manners and a clear voice." The prince bowed and took the advice and walked the shore until he found a place where the world seems to end in a thought. There he sat as the tide climbed and spoke to it as to a lord. The tide accepted him as a litter accepts a trusted guest and bore him down along watery avenues roofed with blue. The palace of the Sea King is not built with timber and tile. It is made of the order of currents and the patience of coral. Pillars rise like the ancient bones of whales, and the floor is strewn with sand so fine it keeps the softest footfall a secret. Lanternfish hang like patient stars where a corridor needs lighting. The gates are guarded by fish with stern mouths and eyes that roll like old generals recounting campaigns. There are gardens of kelp that turn in slow dances and courtyards paved with shell. The lord of this city is called Watatsumi, or Ryujin, and his beard moves like a wave that has chosen to sit down and listen. Huri arrived at the gate and was admitted not because of his name, but because of the rightness of his approach. Hands open, head slightly lowered, voice asking rather than demanding. He was brought to a pavilion where a woman sat with the stillness of water held in a bowl. She was the daughter of the Sea King, and her name was Toyotama Haim, which means abundant jewels. The phrase suits her. She was the shimmer that forms when moonlight presses its cool fingers upon a dark surface. She lifted her eyes and the room forgot to breathe. Stories agree that love came upon them with the precision of a hawk, not a wound delivered by surprise, but a swift alignment in which two shapes suddenly fit, and the world makes a small sound of approval. The Sea King looked upon the visitor and in a dozen heartbeats read the marks of lineage and courtesy written on a brow. He welcomed the prince and asked his business. Huri told the truth without decoration. "I have lost my brother's hook," he said. "I seek it because the peace of my house requires the very hook that was given." Ryujin nodded. He summoned his fish. They came in a shimmer that moved like a curtain drawn across a stage. He asked each one whether a hook had troubled its throat. A red sea bream twisted and gaped. The servants retrieved the hook from its gills and presented it upon a shell that glittered with the quiet satisfaction of a task properly completed. What followed the chronicles are content to describe simply as joy. Huri remained in the palace as an honored guest. The Sea King became a father in all but name. Toyotama Haim became a wife. Their wedding is sung with imagery that belongs to the floor of the ocean and to the lights that live there. Pearls attended, not as ornaments but as stars permitted to shine at a lower altitude. Crabs moved like scribes and wrote good omens in sand that does not forget. There are myths that remain forever young. This one is allowed to be settled and glad for a time, and that is a rare permission. Yet home is a gravity that does not sleep. After 3 years, Huri felt a pull toward the mountains that had taught him to move lightly, and toward the house where his father's counsel had set him on this path. He went to his wife and asked leave to return to the upper world, promising a swift message and a swift return. Toyotama Haim listened as women who have loved princes listen. She did not bind his promise with chains. She asked only that he remember what was owed to the sea. Her father pressed 2 treasures into his hands to ease a difficult encounter waiting above. They are called the tide-controlling jewels. One brings water and one draws it away. With one a plane can be drowned, with the other it can be reclaimed. That the Sea King does not give such things without reason. He knew that Huri's quarrel with his brother would be waiting like a cup that had not been emptied. The prince rose from the water to the familiar coastline and sought out his brother. Hoderi was no less stiff than before, and perhaps a measure more proud, for resentment does not sleep during an absence. Huri returned the lost hook. He did not lecture or moralize. He asked for peace and was refused. The elder fished with grievance for bait and cast nets of threats. Then Huri raised the first jewel in his palm and spoke the word the Sea King had taught him. The sea climbed the shore, then the street, then the steps, until Hoderi found water at his belt and then at his chest and then at his lips. He called for mercy, which is a word that sits heavily on a proud tongue. Huri raised the second jewel and the water withdrew as a bed is smoothed after a restless night. Hoderi fell to the ground like a fish dropped from a basket. He promised obedience and this time kept the promise. The quarrel ended in the only way some quarrels can end. Not in love, not yet, but in a recognition that there are limits and that a boundary can be a form of grace. Now the sea, which had served as stage and palace, returned in a new form. Toyotama Haim followed her husband to shore to give birth to their child on dry land. She asked Huri to build a birthing hut of beech reeds and to thatch it as carefully as a temple. She asked for privacy without pleading for it. "Do not look upon me during the birth," she said. The prohibition is not decorative in such a tale, it is the very plank on which the next step must be placed. Huri promised, and for a time the promise held. The working of the world is sometimes framed by curiosity as a room is framed by its walls. The moment came when the prince broke his vow. Perhaps he heard a sound, and fear pried open his resolve. Perhaps pride wanted to see the proof of what he had made. Whatever the reason, he looked. He saw not a woman laboring, but the true shape of a being of the sea giving life on the land. The old texts name that form Wani, a word that can point to a dragon or a great sacred creature made from the strength of deep water. The sight struck him, the way lightning strikes even when it does not kill. He recoiled. He had looked where he was asked not to look. He had seen what should have remained veiled, and by that seeing had broken the arrangement that permits love to live across the boundary between salt water and solid ground. Toyotama Haim felt the breach as a coldness entering the room. She did not rage, she did not plead. She wrapped the newborn in soft cloth and kissed it with the sorrow of a mother who understands she must leave a cradle. She walked into the tide and did not look back. She returned to the palace where lantern fish hang in careful patterns and put her hurt away as women sometimes must. Not because it is small, but because it is very large and must be kept in a room where only the heart can bear to visit it. The child was left to the care of a woman whose name carries the sense of jewel and binding thread, Tamayori Haim, the younger sister, who became nurse and later wife to the boy she raised. The child received a long name that means the cormorant feather thatching was never finished, a phrase that remembers the hut begun and abandoned because a promise broke and sent the mother back to her sea. He grew with the composure that sometimes settles on children who have been carefully tended. Tamayori Haim taught him the proper reverence at thresholds and the patience to listen to elders who tell the same story with a different ending each time. He married her when the years had turned and propriety could be satisfied, and from their union came sons whose names open new pages. The sea princess did not forget him. The songs say that on certain nights she rose upon the beach in the form of a dragon that remembered being a woman and watched from a distance the child playing in the sand. The small boy looked up and smiled at a shape that frightened other children and then returned to his game. The mother went back to her halls of coral and listened to reports from sand crabs who gossip as well as any court attendant. She lived as women who have been hurt sometimes live, in a dignity and a quiet that makes a wide room feel as though a child were asleep behind a nearby screen. The child left on the shore grew as children grow when careful hands steady them. Ugaya Fukiezu learned the ways of both sea and land and kept a house where courtesy stood watch at the door. He grew into a man with the calm of a low tide and the steadiness of a mountain path. He married Tamayori Haim, who had been his nurse, and from their union came 4 sons whose names would turn a great hinge in the story of the islands. The eldest was Etzus, strong in arm and proud of shoulder. Then Inahi, who felt the pull of waves in his dreams and later followed that pull into the halls of the Sea King. The third was Mikeri, who loved the hunt and the rougher corners of the land. The youngest was Kamu Yamato Iwarabiko, who would come to be remembered as Jinmu, the one who would carry a promise eastward and set it down as a capital. The realm of Ninigi had ripened. Fields lay like open pages. Shrines wrote light upon air each morning. Old knowledge moved quietly among the people the way water moves beneath rice roots. Yet there was something in the air, a sense that the work needed a name and a seat, that a lineage beginning with a mirror and a jewel must one day stand up from myth and sit down upon a plain. Iwarabiko was not the loudest of the brothers. He was the one who listened to advice and to omens and to the older gods who whisper through leaf and river. He looked east, where the land of Yamato holds valleys that welcome order and mountains that shelter plans. There, he was told, lies the heart that will beat for many centuries if approached with the right patience. The brothers gathered men who believed more in roads than in raids and built boats that trusted the strength of their ribs. They set out from the southern islands with their provisions and household gods, and the sea acknowledged them with a long, slow lift. They made landfall at the port of Naniwa, where river and sea forget their argument and marry. There they met a chieftain named Naga Tsunehiko, proud in the authority that local success provides, and quick to resent the claims of strangers whose titles arrive on the wind. Words were exchanged that cut deeper than blades. A skirmish followed. An arrow found Itsusa's ribs and cut short a life that had begun with such promise. The brothers mourned and withdrew, for Iwarabiko understood that a battle lost is sometimes a road offered by a god. They turned south and rounded to the coast of Kumano, where the mountains lean toward the sea and the forests speak the language of shrines older than any court. There a dense sleep fell upon the company, a heaviness that in such tales is never merely fatigue. It was a sleep sent by a god who wished to test their purpose. In the dream of Takakuraji, a humble keeper of storehouses, the deity Takemikazuchi placed a sword and a command. "Bring this blade to the leader who sleeps in your storehouse," the message said, "and the sleep will break and his road will open." The man woke and found the sword not only in his memory but in his keeping, as if a thought had learned how to become iron. He carried the weapon to Iwarabiko, who took it with the reverence a man shows a god who brings both victory and restraint. The sleep fell away from the company like a garment that had never properly fitted. From Kumano, they pressed inland. On a day when mist rose from the river in white sleeves, they encountered a guide whose sign is recognized across centuries. The bird had 3 legs and the bearing of an official messenger. It is called Yatagarasu, and it belongs to the company of omens that even the skeptical find themselves quietly honoring. The bird did not give commands. It flew ahead and perched and flew again, drawing the company up ravines and over ridges onto the inner plain of Yamato. The men walked with the ease of those who feel a hand placed gently on their shoulders, and the land received them as a house receives a member of the family returned from a long journey. In time, the bird lifted into a last arc and was lost against a sun that was both witness and sponsor. The way lay open. Nagasunehiko remained a problem. He had claimed the plain in the name of his habits and was not prepared to yield them. Another battle was joined. The sword that had come from a dream performed what it had promised. Iwarabiko did not boast in victory. He drove the resistance from the field and in the wake of that clearing made offerings to the gods of the hills and the rivers he had crossed. For victories are not only about enemies, they are also about permission, the consent of the land itself to be governed. He raised a seat at Kashihara, where the earth holds level as if a careful hand had assured it. There, tradition says, he became the first emperor, a man with a throne that explains itself by pointing to a grandmother of light and a long corridor of divine forebears. So the age of gods placed its hand on the shoulder of the age of men and guided it into its first steps. From that day, the narrative leaves the halls of the sea and the forges of heaven less often. It walks more often in markets and encampments and grain fields. It follows rulers who name the sun as grandmother and yet must contend with the stubborn facts of harvests and roads. Out of this young line came a hero whose name moves through ballads like a gust across a still pond. He is called Yamato Takeru, the brave of Yamato, a prince with a gift for disguise and for moments when all other options have closed. He is remembered not as a lawgiver, but as a remover of stubborn problems when those problems threaten the realm. He was the son of a later sovereign named Keiko, and his youth was a lesson in the danger of force without forethought. He is said to have slain a difficult cousin by cunning, an act that no priest would bless, but that no enemy of the court would forget. His road was not toward a throne, but toward the edges of the realm where order loses its footing. There his qualities, sharp and difficult as they were, would find a proper stage. The first tale that clings to his name belongs to the south. In the country of Kumaso, there lived 2 chieftains whose ferocity had become a saying in neighboring districts. They collected tribute by fear and mistook the silence of the frightened for the respect of the satisfied. The court sent the prince to resolve this. He did not march with banners. He dressed as a woman and entered the house where the brothers held a feast. The eye is easily misled when pride has made it lazy. He sat among the servers and the dancers. When the hour was late and the drink had settled warmly in the veins of his hosts, he stepped close to the elder and drew from beneath his robe a blade that knew its work. He cut the man where strength has no time to rise and then turned to the younger. The elder, dying on the mat he had expected to hold him many more nights, spoke with a clarity that only pain can sharpen. "You are the true brave of Yamato. Take the name." The prince accepted the words as he might accept a heavy cloak, with neither pleasure nor refusal, and wore it for the rest of his life. Before he set out on the long campaign that lay ahead of him, he visited his aunt Yamato Haim, the priestess who kept the Shrine of the Sun at Ise. She received him not as a doting elder, but as a keeper of sacred responsibilities. She placed in his hands the sword that had once resided within a serpent, and later been a token of reconciliation between a storm and a sun. Alongside the sword, she gave a small pouch containing the means to make fire, a charm that would answer a man in danger. He took both with a bow that acknowledged the weight of being entrusted with myths that had become metal. On the eastern plain, treachery came dressed as hospitality. A local lord invited the prince to a hunt in high grass. The party moved outward through the reeds, and then the fields began to breathe fire, lines of flame laid by hands that had planned this from the start. The flames drew a ring that tightened with the glad malice of a net. The prince stood his ground. He drew the serpent blade and swept it through the grass at his feet. The cut opened a way out. He brought out the fire charm from Ise and lit his own line of flame and asked the wind to carry it outward. The wind obeyed the better idea. The counterfire leapt and met the first blaze and wrestled it down into a confusion that had no direction left. The prince walked through smoke and outran the last tongues of flame that reached for his boots. He turned upon his host and settled a debt that no court would be asked to reopen. There were other encounters. He took ships along jagged coastlines and persuaded river forts to stand down. He faced a boar that was more spirit than animal and planted its tusks in a tree as a reminder to those who boast. He challenged the god of Mount Ibuki with an arrogance that the mountain remembered. The god sent a storm of ice that beat him to the ground and left him unsteady for days with a sickness that no medicine could touch. After that encounter, he carried a fragility within him like a hairline crack in fine porcelain. Heroes are not granted invincibility. They are granted time for one more necessary thing. He visited the shrine where the serpent sword would one day be kept and honored rather than used, a place called Atsuta, whose air seems to know how to compose itself. He sent the blade back to rest there. Even a prince can grow weary of the weight that a great weapon places on the spirit. He crossed mountain ranges and sat at the mouths of rivers and thought of a wife he had married in the east, whose patience could stop a quarrel between warriors. He began the homeward journey, not accompanied by drums, but by the quiet recognition that belongs to a figure traveling alone. Sickness followed him. On the plain near Nobo, his strength failed as a banner fails when the wind loses interest. He laid himself down in grass that seemed to know the exact length of his remaining life. When he died, the air above him took on a quality that sometimes attends the last moments of those who have spent their days in service to something wider than themselves. His companions built a tomb and placed clay figures upon it, the Haniwa sentinels that face outward to watch against insult. Then, as the old accounts tell it, a white bird rose from the mound and flew across the marshes and the inlets, looking for the place where grief meets sky. They followed it to a final resting that felt proper. In that way, the man whose name had been given to him by an enemy dying on a mat left a sign that even sorrow could admire. In these stories, you can hear a culture deciding what it wants courage to be. It is skill as much as muscle. It is the intelligence to enter a house dressed as a woman when a direct assault would close every door. It is the restraint to give a sword to a shrine and walk with lighter hands. It is the knowledge that a fire set in the right place saves a life, and a fire set in the wrong place destroys a village. It is also the acceptance that even the most accomplished blade cannot cut the law that all living things obey. The prince who did not fear the boar or the traitor or the steepest ridge could not overcome the cold of a mountain he had mocked. His death gave the country a new kind of memory, not a catalogue of victories, though there were many, but a pattern by which to measure the use of force and the limits of even the most gifted of men. From the seat at Kashihara, the line that claimed the sun as ancestor continued. Priests kept the mirror polished and the jewels safe and reminded young rulers that the sword is drawn last. Each spring, the fields looked up and asked whether they could trust the hands that turned them. The answer, more often than not, was yes. because those hands remembered a grandson who came down a mountain carrying gifts from a goddess, a young man who sailed beneath a three-legged bird, a prince who opened a wall of fire with a borrowed word, and who later let a white bird carry his last hours over a wetland at the edge of the world. But these are large signs that taught small lessons. Bow at thresholds. Honor promises made at sea. Make room for laughter at councils. Ask a mountain before you place your pride upon it. The age of gods had taught the rhythm of creation and loss and return. The age of emperors added the discipline of law and the patience of records. Together, they made a story told in shrines where ropes hang like slow rivers, and in tombs where clay figures face outward into the fields, and in theatres where a dancer stamps a wooden stage and calls the sunlight home. A people does not live by bread alone. It lives by the sentences it repeats to itself when storms wake in the night and when seasons turn without warning. These chapters are such sentences.